Earlier this month, they filed a brief with the United States First Circuit Court of Appeal in the case of Dr. Stephen Skoly against Governor Daniel McKee, former health directors Nicole Alexander Scott and James McDonald and others. And they're our guests today. We welcome back to In the Dugout, Dr. Stephen Skoly. Doc, welcome back.
Mike, thanks for having me. And let me say this up front, as I never do enough to you and Greg and my counsels. I appreciate everything you guys are doing, and I thank you very much for staying up to speed on this case. I can't believe we're basically going 3 years into this.
Yep.
3 years into this adventure. Kind of crazy.
We're going to get into some details, but let me first welcome your attorney, Greg Piccirilli. Greg, welcome back to In the Dugout.
Good afternoon, Mike, and thank you for having me.
All right.
Hi,
Now
Doc.
you're both playing ball today. Doc Skoly, you've got a cap on. What's your cap say?
This says old school, kind of in honor of some of the old common sense things that we probably should have done. And certainly old school honors the Constitution, the rule of law, and the way I think our country would like to go, but seems to be a little misdirected at this point.
Yeah, sometimes old school doesn't seem so bad right about now, does it? This new school stuff, this new globalism, woke stuff. And Greg Piccirilli, you've got, what's that say? Florida for Trump?
Florida for Trump. I had a DeSantis for governor hat, but MAGA hat. But now that DeSantis is out, I can wear this.
So that's relevant to you for two reasons. You're a voting resident of Florida now, correct? Even though you still practice law here in Rhode Island with your license. And also you were a local attorney in Rhode Island for President Trump in the bogus case that tried to get him off the ballot in Rhode Island. And you were the local attorney on that, correct?
Yes, I was. Yeah.
All right. Doc,
I'm gonna take it off.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Doc, like you were saying, it's been 3 years. It was October of 2021 when your business was shut down, your surgical, oral and facial surgical practice. You were shut down for 6 months. You filed a lawsuit later that year. It's gone through the ringer. We'll get into the technical of it with Greg in just a second, but how you hanging? You hanging in there with all these delays and everything else?
I am. Hopefully I have a lot of staying power. I mean, there's not days where I don't get a little demoralized, especially if you read, everything that's going on in the press. And now you look at, some of those people that were behind basically the pandemic shutdowns and all the mandates, and, their mea culpas now are coming out, whether it's, Anthony Fauci fessing up or Francis Collins having regrets. It's a little too late. But when the pandemic started, they had already made up their mind they were not going to be confused by the facts. And it was, government overreach. I mean, at this point in time, it's really not about whether Stephen Skoly has got a vaccine or not. It's about my whole due process and just my constitutional rights as a citizen or around as a citizen of this country.
Yeah, the way I see it is does some kind of declared emergency supersede your constitutional rights to not only to earn a living, but to speak? So we're going to get into that in a second. Greg, could we just very quickly, just the dates, establish the timeline? His practice was shut down October 1st, 2021. He was allowed to open in March after the state rescinded its mandate. You guys first filed suit in Superior Court when?
Actually, no, we went right to federal court.
Right to federal court.
I believe it was early February of 2022.
All right. Then at some point in the following months, the federal court dismissed your case, right?
Well, a lot happened in between. So
I just want to get the timeline quickly.
Yeah. So in February 22, we filed, with the help of the NCLA, the National Civil Liberties Alliance, kind of the new conservative, bigger and better ACLU. They assist, they represented Doc and Christy Durant and I were local counsel. And at that time, our main concern, our main argument was to get a restraining order to allow Doc to get back to work. We literally had a hearing scheduled for a day in March, like March 15th. And on March 11th, I get notified by the state attorney, never mind, we're dropping the vaccine regulation. Doc can go back to work. Okay, great, thank you. I mean, we celebrated, right, Doc? That was a great day, a great win. I think Doc's case went a long way in stopping the state from turning the emergency regulation, which was for 6 months, into a permanent regulation. I mean, they did end up with a permanent regulation.
Right.
It didn't have the same mandate. So I think Doc, in that regard, for all the people who didn't take the vaccine and wanted to keep working, they have Doc to thank for that, because I think it was his case that helped push Rido, not extending that.
And Doc, you were right up front saying, look, this is about me, but I'm also here speaking on behalf of other healthcare workers who were wronged, who may have been fired, may have retired, or may have been forced to take the vaccine against their better judgment, and their rights as healthcare providers and as U.S. citizens. So your case really, and as Greg just said, your case really probably helped relieve that mandate sooner than later. That was your goal all along, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I the way this transpired, I mean, I thought I wasn't going to take, and I'm not an anti-vaxxer, and just quick history on that. I worked for USAID. I've traveled a lot. I've had more vaccines than most people. I had Bell's palsy a couple times, and there was a known risk of having recurrence of your Bell's palsy. I had already had COVID. I had been practicing like all the other healthcare workers through the pandemic when there was no vaccine. I didn't need the vaccine. I wasn't going to take a vaccine that wasn't going to prevent the transmission of the disease. And I use the word vaccine. There are some scientists that really say it's a form of gene therapy. It's not a vaccine. I'll leave that out. I wasn't going to take a vaccine that I didn't need, that would potentially give me harm. There were known complications with it, and now it's coming out to pass that there are some unknown complications, with the vaccine. And if you look at it at this point in time, the mandate now would have mandated me to get a vaccine that is no longer legal in the United States of America. So I think the government and local officials, and it's too bad because the public has lost a lot of trust in public health officials through this. But they disrespected certainly myself. They disrespected my staff and their families. They disrespected the patients. They disrespected the science because they didn't want to hear the science. And quite honestly, they disrespected themselves, and they don't even know it because they were ignorant about everything that was going on. So again, it wasn't about me in the vaccine at this point. It's about just the whole due process. I thought that by publicly requesting a challenge to the mandate, I would be offered a hearing by state statute, which I'm legally required to have before my regulatory body. That to date has never happened. And instead, they issued a false compliance order because I never had a hearing. They put it on a website. Even after, as Greg said, we had a stipulation agreement and was able to go back to work after the temporary restraining order, they still kept an order on the website.
Right.
For
made you look bad, and you weren't allowed to get payments from
and I get
insurance companies. Yeah.
And every day, and I'm out and about, there's not a day that goes by where someone doesn't say, "Are you back in practicing? Did you get your license back? Oh, I'm glad you did this. I wish I never got the vaccine. I wish I could have challenged it." That happens every day. And again, my license was never in question. The health and safety of my patients and staff was never an issue. My ability to practice was suspended by government overreach in this particular case. And they didn't like the fact that I didn't agree with the narrative. And again, at one point, one of the attorneys said, I probably defied the mandate. No, I requested an appropriate, I wanted to publicly challenge it based on science.
Yep. And you were never really allowed to have that hearing, present your evidence and whatnot. All right. I still just want to establish very quickly the background. On July 20th, the U.S. District Court dismissed your case at the request of the state. And then we go to earlier this month on January 10th, you guys officially filed your brief in your appeal in the United States First Circuit Court. All that correct, Greg?
Yes. Yep, that's exactly right.
All right. Now, I want to go to Greg. In your brief, in the summary section here, oh, did I miss it already? I keep scrolling past it. Yeah, there are basically three, if you were just not to go into detail, but just restate what we're seeing on the screen. These are the three arguments you're making that you're asking the First Circuit Court to consider in Doc Skoly's case. Go ahead, Greg.
Correct. So now that now that the injunctive relief is not necessary because Doc was able to go back to work, there's still an issue of his damages that he suffered for when he was wrongfully prohibited from practicing, and also, as Doc mentioned, the lingering effects of them leaving that notice of violation up for months after it was supposed to be withdrawn. And so the three claims that we have are all constitutional claims. The first two, the equal protection and due process claims, are 14th Amendment claims under the U.S. Constitution. And the third one is the First Amendment retaliation claim. And really, just to really just try to summarize it, the equal protection claim is based on the fact, amongst other things, but the one glaring fact was that while Doc was prohibited from practicing because he did not have the COVID vaccine, although he had natural immunity, there were COVID positive healthcare workers that were allowed to work in hospitals with patients while they were COVID positive. And if there's a rational basis test for under the equal protection law statute or constitutional provision. If that's not irrational, nothing is. The state has never tried to explain why it was so desperate to have those people come back to work, but somehow Doc was not. Well, except for, I think there was a comment made by the judge that, well, like, Doc was just like a cosmetic surgeon. He didn't really.
Yeah,
he didn't
just
do,
a dentist.
He didn't do vital work, which I'll just leave it there. Doc is the preeminent oral surgeon in Rhode Island. He was even before COVID, he was performing life-saving surgeries for the most vulnerable people in the state. Mentally ill patients at Zambarano, prisoners at the ACI, people who could go nowhere else to get, and for anybody to think that dental surgery, there was a former football player down here in Tampa who they found dead. I forget the gentleman's name. He played for the Tampa Bay Bucks. You know what he died of? Sepsis from his dental. He had dental problems and didn't go to a dentist, and he died from not getting dental surgery. So just think about that for a minute.
All right, before we go on with your legal arguments, Doc, you were there, you were listening. We see it in the transcript. She just refers to you as just a non-emergency dentist. Did you take that as an insult or just a judge that's completely ignorant and hasn't been listening to your side?
Yes,
I mean, I wish sometimes people in, whether it's the health department or in government, could actually sit in my office. You probably can't do it with all the HIPAA regulations and everything, but I'm sure my patients would allow it. To see what actually transpires during the day. I mean, I trained at the first level 1 trauma center in the country at Cook County Hospital. I do full scope oral and maxillofacial surgery. And as Greg was saying, that includes gunshots, motor vehicle accidents. But when you have things like pandemics and the total healthcare system is disrupted, you'd be stunned to see how many large maxillofacial infections occur. And you're right, those are life-threatening. And there is not only a morbidity, but there is a mortality, certainly in urban centers with facial infections. So no, I wasn't practicing cosmetic dentistry. I wasn't doing it so I could keep making money in my office doing cosmetics. That's not what happened. We were so busy. All you were doing was seeing emergencies. So obviously there's some ignorance going on. I wish the appropriate people could sit, whether it's in an emergency room or and someone who's doing full scope, like myself, oral and maxillofacial surgery, to sit in an office for one day and actually see what goes on. I think their attitudes have completely changed.
Greg, the judge seemed to purposely downplay the importance of Doc's surgery when she said, hey, it's understandable that you would break the rules when there's a real serious emergency. She said if someone's going in for heart surgery, of course, we're not going to require them to wear a mask or get the vaccine. Well, but it's important. A lot of the stuff Doc Skoly does is emergency and life-saving stuff. Is that important in this case?
Well, yeah, and again, that's part of the core basis of our equal protection claim. And again, we felt like, again, this case got dismissed on a motion for summary judgment, which means we never had a hearing. We never got to engage in discovery. We never got to debate the facts. The court was supposed to accept everything that we say is true, and say, even though everything you say is true, you still can't state a claim. You still can't win. And we felt that the fact that the way the state approached unvaccinated people versus COVID positive people, as an example, there were others examples, should have at least survived the motion to dismiss and allow us to try to go to a hearing, to a trial. Now that's just that first claim. The second claim is a due process claim, and as Doc stated, he was never given his day in court, as it were, before the one body that had the right to review his medical license.
Well, not court per se, but he was allowed a hearing according to the Department of Health, right?
Right. I use court in the colloquial sense that his day at a hearing before the Rhode Island Dental Board. The Rhode Island Dental Board, which is the board that licenses Doc and is responsible for hearing complaints against any. And again, the state just made up the rules. They issued a notice of violation, told him to stop practicing, and they ignored the state statutes. That there are two statutes that govern the suspension of a medical license, and they just ignored it. And we never were given a proper opportunity to have a hearing where Doc could argue that he should have been given an exemption given his medical condition. That he could have argued that he had natural immunity.
At least allow the argument, right? At least allow the argument, right?
That he could argue that again, I learned as I was working on this case, I learned about the dental practice. Doc's been using PPE, the protection equipment and masking. He's been doing that for years. That's what dentists do. Have you ever been to a dentist and see the precautions they take? So the idea that he was, that there was a risk of infection in that office was zero.
All right. Before we get to the third claim, Doc, I want to ask you about that. I think it was disheartening. You are and were one of the most respected. Now, the Dental Association includes traditional dentists and major surgeons like you. You were one of the most respected members in that whole entity. Did anybody in that group on that board, either privately or publicly, come to your defense, or was everybody just intimidated by the government?
There was almost, and that's a great question. There was almost, I call it like a swarm consensus. In another word, it's I don't know if it was criminal, it would be like a RICO thing, where the government, all the agencies in government, so the Department of Health, the directors, and the Board of Examiners in Dentistry never heard the case. It went to the Department of Administration. So the Department of Administration and the governor's office made up, as Greg would say, the rules as they went along. The legislative body, so our House and Senate, they just let the emergency orders continue and continue. The Attorney General's office, as I said before, they should represent the citizens of Rhode Island. They're not representing me. In fact, the AG's office is the counsel of record for the Department of Health and the governor. In addition to that, the Department of Labor and Training kind of went at us. They wouldn't let my staff collect unemployment. We had to go to multiple hearings. One of the hearing officers said in a hearing, if I'm, meaning myself, because I've never collected the unemployment, put into the system for the 36 years I've lived here, but That's the least of my worries. But the hearing officer literally said, if you're that hard up for work, why don't you go to Walmart? I hear they're hiring. Could you be any more condescending and disrespectful? Does that answer your question? It was crazy. At times, it was demoralizing. I mean, I thought at one point I'd be down in Florida. I think DeSantis would have me work there in a second.
Oh,
Right. Yeah, well,
they
someone
pay
to
a bonus to
appreciate.
come down here, Doc. They're desperate for the doctors down here. So
Now, I can't find the picture, but there was that one doctor that put up a sign outside his practice on his message board said "Free Skoly," "Free Doc Skoly." So I remember that one. I can't seem to find that picture.
Well, Mike, but speaking of pictures, they put a mugshot of me at the Department of Corrections.
Yeah, like you were a criminal.
Like they call it the wall of shame. You know, Dr. Skoly remains unvaccinated, is not allowed on state property. Like, are you kidding?
Right, talk about just sticking a finger in your eye. My goodness. And some of those exacerbating, vengeful things, Greg, those were included in your original complaint, were they not?
absolutely. As Doc mentioned, the posting, and again, this will get into the First Amendment claim, where
That's your third point. Yeah.
Third point, which is, and again, you want to know why other doctors didn't say anything. I don't know that Rhode Island ever did this, but in other states, in California and Maine, doctors are losing their medical license because not that they didn't take the vaccine. It's because they even if they publicly expressed doubt as to the efficacy of the vaccine, that they have been accused of spreading misinformation in violation of their medical ethics. So
as it turned out, it was the truth.
Yeah, it turned out, it turned out to be the truth. But you wonder why, look, all of us, that, people that think like us, we know there's a lot of cowards out there. I'm going to use that word. There's a lot of cowards. People who wouldn't stand up. If that dental board, and I have no idea who those people are, I could care less who they are. If one of those people could have publicly stated that they thought this was wrong, it might have had some impact. And stated publicly. Why didn't they? Ask them. Someday somebody should ask them. But to get to the First Amendment claim, again, because Doc had the temerity to talk out about this, to talk about the reason why he wasn't getting the vaccine. And again, this wasn't because he was some conspiracy theorist. He was very specific about why he wasn't getting the vaccine. He had natural immunity, and he had a serious risk of a recurrence of a condition, which, and Doc didn't mention this, but if he got a recurrence of that Bell's palsy, he probably would have lost his right to practice, his ability to practice for the rest of his life, potentially. And just think of the economic impact on him that way. I think even his disability.
Yeah, that affects his eye and his vision, which is pretty important for a surgeon, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know, Doc. I think you even have a question of whether your disability would even cover that if you ultimately that happened. So again, these weren't just hey, I'm not I'm flouting the law, blah, just look at me. So and again, the day he says that, they secretly issue this notice of violation without going through the dental board and just leave it open-ended. And this is what, to me, this was the most dramatic part about this. We found out through the course of when they were reviewing the regulation that they did a cost-benefit analysis, the Department of Health. And in that cost-benefit analysis, we found out that over 1,000 healthcare workers were allowed to practice without any disciplinary action being taken against them at all. Doc was the only one.
Because he spoke out. He said something public.
And we had evidence that the reason, and quite frankly, I think the state concedes this point, that they wanted to make an example out of him.
Yeah, no, don't speak out. Yeah, don't speak out or you'll get crushed, right?
Yeah. And that exactly. You had the nerve to speak out. I think the words were, if you just kept your big mouth shut, none of this would have happened.
Doc, it was on this show. One of the places you did an interview, I think, with the Providence Journal, but I think maybe first you came on this show. I think it was September 30th. Said I'm not going to be taking the vaccine for all these reasons, and I want to have my day in not court, but I want to have my day in front of a panel to argue my case. And if you had it to do all over again, would you speak out again, or just quietly this time do it?
I probably speak out more violently now that I've gone through this. Again, I didn't go get a vaccine card. I didn't quietly continue to practice. On the day it was issued, I said, I want an appropriate hearing before my appropriate licensing body, which would have, by state statute, would have been happened and over in about 10 days. It never happened. I wasn't the only, I mean, nationwide, there's a group, it's called the Norfolk Group. They just presented before the US Congress. It's a group of well-known scientists. It included like Jay Bhattacharya, Marty McCary, Martin Kuldroff. I know these guys from lecturing. They were censored on Twitter for their scientific approach to how we manage the vaccine mandate. Victor Davis Hanson out at Stanford, the Hoover Institute, he just talked about COVID chaos. Again, I wasn't trying to do something inappropriate. I was the most appropriate person there.
You think about it, you were censored, you were canceled, right? Yeah, basically,
exactly.
right?
I mean, even the court in their decision to let the state, what made us go to an appellate court, the court said that they weren't going to debate science. They weren't going to go against the recommendations of, the CDC and the Department of Health. Now you have, Fauci fessing up and saying, well, I didn't have mandates. I never closed schools. I never closed factories. Those were recommendations. Even Francis Collins, in his mea culpa, the COVID lockdown was way too narrow. We should have done something different. Well, that's what I tried to do. I tried to have a public debate. I wasn't openly defying it and not proudly defying it like the AG's office said. I wanted an appropriate debate about the science. There was, even the own Department of Health, there's a VAERS system, a vaccine adverse event report system.
Right.
There's multitude of issues of patients getting Bell's palsy. Let's not even go into the total mortality index that exists now around the pandemic. That's completely changed. There were concerns. And again, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I got a shingles vaccine a little while ago, which I recommend. I just wasn't going to get a vaccine that I didn't need. Again, that wasn't going to prevent transmission, with heightened universal precautions that were promulgated by the dental community, certainly oral and maxillofacial surgeons, when the AIDS epidemic started. We're very aware of this. Our offices are very safe. The health and safety of my staff, my patients, that was never in question.
We know you took all those precautions.
Exactly.
Greg, I want to point to this part of the federal court in Rhode Island, district court, of Judge McElroy. Basically, she's saying his liberty to speak, his liberty to work, is nevertheless subject to a reasonable government regulation. We had Judge Flanders, the former state Supreme Court justice, our former board member, who said there is no pandemic exception to the Constitution. Yet, in another part of her comments, well, here it is right here. She basically says the same thing, that this emergency outweighs Dr. Skoly's constitutional rights. Your thoughts as a lawyer?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to read something, and you said Judge Flanders said there's no pandemic exclusion. And one of the other cases I had, before the Rhode Island Supreme Court, I'd done some research, and it dawned on me, when was one of the biggest crises, emergency crises this country ever had? It's a civil war, right? You can think of the time of a government needing to suspend constitutional rights when there was during a civil war. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court back in 1866, a year after the war ended, there was a case involving habeas corpus, and
Right.
the argument was
that is one of the provisions that Lincoln suspended, right?
Yeah. And the court said, this is what the Supreme Court said. It's colorful language. It's nice language that they used to write a lot better back then than we do today. He said, the court said the Constitution cannot be suspended for necessity. Time has proven the discernment of our ancestors. No doctrine involving more pernicious consequences was ever invented by the wit of man, than that any of its provisions can be suspended during any of the great exigencies of government.
Wow.
Think of, I mean, was
that a Supreme Court decision?
That's the In re Mulligan case. I'm sorry, the ex parte Mulligan case. For me, it's the habeas corpus case where the Supreme Court said, even in times of a civil war, you can't suspend habeas corpus. And again, what the court was saying there, and I forget which judge it was that wrote that. I might have been Chase. Again, there is nothing more pernicious to a democratic republic with a constitution than this idea that the powers that be, the government, can declare an emergency and use that as an excuse to wipe away all our rights. Because once you, and as dire as the COVID pandemic was,
or appeared to be initially.
I mean, it was not the bubonic plague.
Right.
People were not dropping dead left and right in the streets. We didn't have 50% mortality. So this idea that well, just declare it as an emergency.
I got it.
And then we can do anything we want. So that's how I would just leave this the legal argument right now.
We only have a few minutes left. Let's bring it to current times. You filed your brief in the First Circuit Court of Appeals. They have to accept the case. What, from a timeline point of view, just Greg, what happens next? Do you expect you'll have oral arguments in front of what, one judge, a bunch of judges? How does that work, and when do you expect it to happen? Just very briefly.
Sure. So the First Circuit, it's a panel of 3 judges. And that will probably, the court has already told us it'll probably be sometime in May. So we'll have, again, some more briefing be done by the end of February, probably be on the calendar for argument in May, and most likely have a decision by the end of June.
So you and your team will present, and the state's attorneys, the same attorneys you dealt with in the federal court?
No, they have the AG's office has an appellate attorney that is handling it.
All right, Doc.
The attorney, by the way, just as an aside, the attorneys that were representing Doc in this, who were representing the state, have both resigned from the AG's office.
Okay. All right, Greg, I'm going to come back with your legal handicapping, but Doc, it's been a long battle for you. You've suffered greatly. Your practice. I know you personally. I know you're still not back up to full speed with your patients and your staffing. It's been almost 2 years now since you've come back to practice, and you're still trying to catch up. How hopeful are you about this First Circuit appeal?
I don't have any experience in that. I'm glad that I've done what I've done. I basically openly challenged some mandates which I thought were unscientific. My narrative went against the government. I'm sorry about that. I didn't start this problem, but I intend to see it through. And hopefully there's some reasonable thoughts out there that realize that it is important. I don't want to downplay the beginning of the pandemic, like you guys have mentioned. There was a lot of unknown, but very quickly there was a lot of known. This wasn't like the case, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, where they had mandates because the mortality rate of the disease was, 35%. When we look back at what COVID really did, and you look through all the pandemic lockdowns and everything we did, it doesn't approach that. And it's unfortunate because now the citizens, whether it's our country or all around the world, they're not going to trust public health officials.
No.
It's going to
And
take
Greg, and to that,
generations.
yeah, and to that point, Greg, I mean, I don't know if it's, I didn't read it in it. I only skimmed the paperwork, both at the federal court level and now your brief here to the circuit court. But what Doc Skoly just said was very important. At the time he decided not to follow the mandate and have his argument heard, and at the time they issued the mandate, there was a lot known about this vaccine that it wasn't as advertised. So is negligence or dishonesty of the state as good as you might say their intentions were? They were negligent and not understanding, not looking into the actual research that was starting to become apparent at that time. Is that part of your argument before this kind of medical research negligence?
Well, it's not really a negligence kind of a case or argument, but to that point, the fight and the challenge we've had, and I've explained this to Doc, and the challenge is going to be an uphill battle.
Sure.
Because you still have judges as this trial judge made it clear on many occasions that she wasn't going to revisit the science of, for example, that natural immunity is as good as, or if not better than, the vaccine. She refused to even entertain that discussion. Again, in a due process argument.
All right, hold on right there. Hold on right there. Let me bring this up. Here's that quote. She says, she is the court right here. I'm not going to debate science with you because I'm not a virologist. And my guess is that neither are you.
Well, the funny thing is that Greg Dolan, who was
hold on. But yet, in murder cases, they review forensics. Neither the judge nor the lawyers or forensic scientists, yet you bring in experts for this reason. Since when is science not part of a trial?
Again, the court judges, just as public officials, just as the news media, the legacy news media, nobody would ever they're the experts. Who are we to question them? In what other field? And what other, as you say, what other, and even in the medical field, I remember part of what motivated me to get into all these types of cases was way back at the beginning of the pandemic. Bobby Kennedy Jr. I saw him give a lecture. My wife actually saw it and had me look at it. I was never a huge fan of his politics. He was on the opposite side. But you can't question the man's brilliance. He argued 3 cases in the Supreme Court on administrative law. And his point was, we debate science all the time.
Right.
Every administrative regulation that has anything, and not just medical science, any kind of science. One side has their experts, the other side has their experts. A hearing officer hears them both and makes a decision. I believe this one, or I believe that one. And then that can get appealed. This has been administrative law for 80 years. This is nothing new. The idea that we do not question this is just ludicrous.
That's what I'm trying to say.
It's just ludicrous. And again,
then we can never allow forensics in a courtroom about bullets and and the markings on the bullets, or since when?
The medical examiner, what he says, that's it. You can't question what the medical examiner says. That doesn't make sense.
All right, Greg, thanks for your review. Good luck in your appeal. Doc Skoly. What?
I said, thanks for having me. And
I want to get the final word to Doc. Doc, like your attorney said, you got an uphill battle. You'll likely know by June, because what you're asking for is for the case to be sent back to federal court for a full hearing where you can present your expert scientific witnesses. You can have full discovery. We can find out what the government knew and didn't know about the vaccines, what due diligence they did do or didn't do, and you can present your witnesses, the bells, Pauls, and all that. That's all you're asking for, right? Is for this case to go back to United States Rhode Island federal court and have a full hearing, right? That's what you're asking for, correct, Greg?
Sure, and in a hearing, there's going to be discovery, and I'd like to know, why was I never granted my hearing by state statute before my regulatory body? Who was behind that? When the health department in related cases, when they say masks work, well, now we know they don't work. We knew that a long time ago. Vaccines underperformed. They did not work like advertised. Where was the data you were relying on? I'm sorry that I went against the narrative because it started this problem, but I'm not sorry that I did, because I don't want citizens' rights, including mine, trampled on. What's next? And this can never happen again.
And it's not just about damages to you, but it's about this precedent being set. And as Greg mentioned earlier, going back to the Civil War, you can't just cavalierly on some emergency suspend constitutional rights. I mean, this is a huge precedent setting potential case, right, attorney?
I think so. I have so many people come up to me and say, listen, I would have never gotten a vaccine. I've never had a vaccine in my life. I'm young, healthy, but I have a family to protect. My kids are in college. I have a mortgage payment. I'm the caretaker for an elderly, parent. I had no choice. If I didn't get a vaccine, I was going to get fired.
Right.
What kind of country is that? That's crazy.
Greg, it is about something bigger, isn't it, than just docs being shut down?
Absolutely. I called Doc a pathfinder. He's he is a beacon for so many people. He's lucky that he has the wherewithal to survive this. There are a lot of people that didn't, and they're still struggling because of that. So, we keep fighting. We have our victories and we have our losses, but we're going to keep fighting because we know we're on the right side, and history will judge us that way.
Gentlemen, we're out of time. Greg Piccirilli, attorney for Dr. Stephen Skoly. Doc, Greg, thank you for joining us here on In the Dugout, and we wish you, of course, all the best of luck in your First Circuit Court of Appeals appeal.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Thanks again, Mike.
All right. These are two brave men. Greg Piccirilli, of course, has been involved in many COVID-related constitutional rights cases. He's won a bunch of them. Dr. Skoly, just for the record, is our Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity's chairman. He's a personal friend of mine, but he's also a citizen with rights, and that's why we highlight his case for no other reason than the precedent it could set. So again, thanks to both of them. Thanks to you, our fans, for tuning in. For In the Dugout, Mike sent us out. See you next game.